Well, today on our podcast, we have a mouth-watering guest in many different ways because this is a guest that we've been wanting to get on the show for quite a while. Purely because, in a way, he's kind of doing what we do, hopefully interpreting some of the science and some of the issues around sports science and putting them into books, and also doing his regular columns on the Sweat Science portfolio, which is now on runnersworld.com. Used to be on other channels, which we won't talk about here. But Alex Hutchinson is probably one of the most prolific athletes, writers, scientists, scientific reporters, I would guess, is the best way to describe him, that we've seen, and has regularly done interviews and podcasts with various people, including Peter Attia, and one of our guests last year, Malcolm Gladwell, even spoke to him as well. And I think what's fascinating about what he says here is talking about how he does his research, how he gets into these subjects, how he interprets them, how he gets the science and make sure that the credibility of his publications is done right, and how he interprets that news himself. Because not only is he somebody who's a good journalist and a good writer, but somebody that participates in the sport of running at a pretty high level and has done for quite some time in his life. So he lives and breathes sports science, and I think what you'll find here is a man who has a lot of passion for what he talks about over the next hour or so. Ross.
Yeah, he's one of the communicators, right? Like this, and we've spoken in the last while about this challenge that sports science faces because I think of, okay, this is going to be a leap maybe, but of all the sciences, like the science of health and exercise, sport, well-being is so applicable to every single person, right? Whether you're objective is to treat or prevent a chronic disease, or whether it's to break a 220 marathon. I mean, you've got these two extremes, but everyone's interested in like the things that sports science can tell them. But we've said on this podcast, like the sports sciences themselves don't do that very well. So then it falls to people who are going to find interesting science, try and peel back the scientific stuff to find the insight and then
Mm.
communicate and explain that to people. And that's what Alex does. So a few things I'm looking to learn are the process. How do you tell what's credible and what's not? We've had scientists on this podcast telling us that sports science has a massive replication crisis. And oftentimes it's because one study comes out and it's rubbish, but it produces an interesting finding. We don't see the 12 studies that might refute it because of non-findings, but we see the one, and then the media sometimes leaps on the one. You know, as an editor, new study shows that caffeine XYZ, it's in the magazines, and it's the sort of thing that Alex will then write about. But you
Mm.
want to write about those things with a credible, robust, scientific integrity, and that's a massive challenge because you can you can adopt the influencer approach to communication, or you can adopt the scientist one, and they're very different things.
Yeah. Well, enjoy our interview with Alex Hutchinson. So, Alex, welcome to the Science of Sport. I'm quite excited to do this because I kind of feel that I've been connected to you for the last sort of 15, 20 years because you've off and on written for Runner's World magazine in the States. Your science column now, I think, is now going to be on runnersworld.com, which means hopefully for us here in South Africa, we'll be able to access some of your amazing work. But I mean, you've been in this space for quite some time as a journalist and a writer and that sort of thing. I mean, when did you first start writing about the science, the sports science that we're going to talk about?
Yeah, I guess so. I went to journalism school. I did finished a degree in 2005. And then I spent 1 year as a general assignment reporter with a daily newspaper covering car crashes and stuff. And then I went freelance, which is another way of saying I didn't get a job. Um, and it took me about a year, maybe let's say 2 years. Initially, I was writing about just anything that could pay the bills. I was going to accounting conferences and stuff. But I was my background was as a competitive runner, and I had been a scientist but in a totally different area as a physicist before. So starting around 2008, let's say, I was kind of knocking on the door trying to say, "Hey, let me write about the science of, of endurance." And around that time, there was this blog that a couple guys were writing from Cape Town that was starting to explain for a broader audience some of the research that was going on, and I realized that that there was a whole body of research that, as an athlete, I'd been totally oblivious to, and so yeah, so I guess the short answer to your question is like that's what 17 years now,
Hmm.
and of which the last, let's say, 15 or 16, it's been like, that's my focus.
So that blog you're talking about, is that the one that Ross you did? Is that the one you're
Yes,
referring
yes.
to?
A blog. I mean, this podcast is, I guess, the continuation of that blog, but Ross was writing from inside the fortress, as it were. And I'd read, look, the first book I ever got when I started running in high school was the, I don't know, what's the second edition or something of Tim Noakes's Lore of Running. So I'd read that, so I knew there was some science, but it all felt very far away and like settled. I thought that everyone understood everything about how the body worked and how running worked, and it didn't seem to have much application to me. But so getting a view of science as it was happening, as old ideas were being challenged, and different perspectives were clashing was really interesting. And so reading that blog made me think, hey, there's stuff to read about here. And then I came across, like, there's a sort of long convoluted story that I won't share about how I got my first assignment from Runner's World. Basically, like, the fact checker at Popular Mechanics, where I was writing, had previously been an intern at Runner's World and found out I was a runner, and had a chance encounter with a Runner's World editor on the street in New York. Ran after her and said, "Hey, there's this guy. You should get him to run. He has a science background." And so and initially I was just writing like conventional how to train by with your heart rate. Call up two coaches and an athlete, and they'll tell you what they've been doing for the last 40 years, and you write about that. But in starting to write those stories, I came across a sort of point counterpoint debate about dehydration that Tim Noakes wrote. I can't remember who Michael Sacca maybe was taking the opposite perspective, and the debate was about dehydration impairs performance, yes or no? And or something like along those lines. And I just thought, is this a joke? Like, of course dehydration impairs performance. And then I read that study, and this was, I think, about 2007. And I read Tim Noakes's case against the sort of conventional view of dehydration. And I thought, oh, this isn't crazy, that there's some actual live debates here. And so that got me really interested. The fact that it wasn't just the question of like, how does running work? It was the fact that these questions weren't settled yet and were being settled in real time that was really fun.
I mean, it is quite amazing that we're all so interconnected in many ways. You and I through Runners World, and obviously, starting to read Ross when you were both probably quite young. I'm interested to know. I mean, I suppose what's fascinating is that you've come from a perspective of almost believing that, reading the law of running and going, okay, well, here's the truth. And then 15 years later, you've discovered that everything can be challenged, which I kind of think, Ross, that's what you've been doing for most of your career. Have you been surprised at how sort of things have changed, how paradigms have shifted so much, and even in a decade, things have changed so much?
Yeah, I mean, it is a little surprising how quickly the sort of orthodoxy has changed. I remember in a previous episode, I think maybe the Story of Endurance episode you guys did, Ross was saying, like, it's hard to remember how controversial it was to say things that feel so obvious now, that we're not just like a car with no driver. So yeah, things have changed, but I think that the deeper sort of realization it goes to the question of like, what is authority and what is truth, and what do you believe? And I think when I started, I would say, so I think the conventional way of writing a running story, like when I first wrote with Runner's World, was like I was saying, is like you call up a coach, you call up a couple of athletes, you get some anecdotes, and you say, this is, if you want to do heart rate training, you get, the athlete says, I used to train too hard. Now I have a heart rate monitor and I don't train hard. And that was a science training story. And I thought, look, we can do better than this. Let's read peer-reviewed studies and call up scientists who study this stuff. And so for a very brief period of time, I thought this is the way we can find the truth. But then, thanks to the work of people like Tim and Ross, and I sort of understood that actually I could write. You could ask me to write a story about dehydration, and I could call up two scientists and read 5 papers, and I could write two. I could do that and write 2 completely opposing stories, but be confident that I had written the truth because I had called scientists and read peer-reviewed papers. And so that that realization was challenging. Like it sucks when you realize that there's you can't just look at the answers in the back of the book and get the truth. But I guess my response to that in terms of how I've tried to report is what I tr in the perfect article that I write, what I'm doing is sharing what the evidence is. And of course now I layer on some of my opinions and stuff, but I try and keep that back, and everyone has perspectives and stuff. But what I want, if I'm writing about dehydration, what I want to do is say, here's a new study that tested such and such. Here's the key graph from that study. You can take a look at it and you can decide, are you convinced by these, this n equals 7 with a bunch of scatter, or are you not? But I'm going to tell you this is the nature of the evidence, and you can add it to your own preconceptions and stuff, as opposed to trying to speak from on high, as we would have done in a lot of Runner's World articles, of say this is how it is. This is and so therefore this is what you should do.
Mm. I guess as a writer and a journalist and as an editor, I understand that there's always that complexity, which is sometimes difficult to get across in sort of writing for a magazine which is trying to explain stuff to the average person. And I think Malcolm Gladwell, when he was speaking to us last year, was talking about the fact that sometimes it's so tempting to look at that sort of that pull out point and create that bit of clickbait that then gets people to click on your article and give you the numbers, etc., etc. Do you find that there's a bit of tension between that, between wanting to creating a story that explains something versus that need to get people to click on it because it's making it more accessible, in other words?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's a enormous crushing tension, and the tension is it's existential, right? Like,
Mm.
uh, if you're trying to communicate and nobody reads your article, you haven't communicated it, and so maybe the best way to sort of illustrate that is to talk about headlines, right?
Mm.
And obviously the classic for maybe listeners who aren't on the inside of journalism, it's like the classic way things work is a journalist writes a story and then the editor writes the headline and the subheadline. And so
Mm.
you slave over this very nuanced article where you're trying to convey the uncertainties. And then the editor comes along and slaps on this headline, which is might seem to be pure clickbait. And so this is a common thing that journalists will complain about. But
Mm.
in the internet era, things change because now you can really see in real time, are people clicking on a story or not? And so I would write articles, there'd be a headline put on, and people on social media would say, "Oh, come on, that headline's misleading." And first of all, I'd say, "Okay, you try and convey the nuances of a very complicated debate in 7 words. Like, be my guest. You tell me how to do it." But eventually, my editors would be like, "Okay," would say the same thing to me. So if you have such strong feelings about how the headline should be, whenever you write an article, you submit a headline with it, and and when I did that, we started to do that, it really gave me it brought this tension home because I do want to have my articles read. And in the internet era, I don't ask for the numbers. I don't want the numbers because I don't want to be writing for clicks. But my editors can periodically share with me like, yes, this article got 9 clicks and this one got 150,000 clicks, whatever. Like I'm making up numbers here, but the truth is, if you don't compete in the marketplace of attention, then you don't have a job. And so, look, I don't want to write for clicks, but when I'm looking through the table contents of a journal and deciding what to write about, I have to ask myself not just, is this interesting, but it's like, can I make this interesting to other people? Can I make it accessible? And which audience are we talking about? Are we talking about the audience of the science of sport who is interested and tolerant of complexity and ambiguity? Or am I writing for a daily newspaper where only 2% of the audience is going to be able to handle that? And if I want to reach them, I have to really, really dial back the level of complexity and make decisions about what to leave out.
Mm. Ross, you see, our world is tough for the world of journalism, you see.
Poor journalists. Yeah, yeah. This is a cry for sympathy, right?
So, I mean,
Well, I mean, the podcast in recent memory that I remember this tension coming up with was when we did the Zone 2 interview with Brendan Gerd. And the whole point of the podcast was to shake the zone two tree a little bit because I thought people Milan and Attia a little bit too confident and actually saying things that were wrong about zone two. So Mike and I knew we were going into that podcast with a bit of a disruptor attitude. But then Mike called it. This was the headline: why everything you know about zone two training is probably wrong. And I'll be candid. I remember because Mike uploads the pod, I saw that I was like, oh God. And sure enough, like within the first day, that podcast got more criticism on Discourse, which is our kind of like supporters club, where you have maybe the most discerning of the discerning listeners, and they see a headline like that and they bristle because they understand that it's not probably as black and white as everything you know about Zone 2 training is wrong, and then they're critical of it, right? But the people who would be hooked into that are the people who don't normally listen. So that's who you're looking to speak to, Mike. Whereas
Mm,
I'm like all in the gray, and when I see black and white, I get very nervous. So we have this podcast, this tension even between the two of us.
mm, for sure.
And I don't think there's a way of escaping the tension. I think in the best scenarios, that tension is productive, and the two of
Mm.
you are pulling. Maybe Mike is pulling you to be a little to be more accessible, and you're pulling Mike to make sure that it's not losing too much nuance. But I do think that question of different audiences is important. That the right way of addressing a topic for one audience is not not always the right way of addressing it for another audience because they don't even start they don't have the basic start to understand what the debate is or what the nuance is. And so one way of saying that is, well, then you should never talk about this topic for a broad audience because they don't understand the nuance. And I don't think that's fair or
Mm,
useful. I think it should be possible to talk about complicated topics to audiences that aren't familiar with the topic. And you have to understand that there's going to be a loss of nuance there, that you're not going to be able to convey everything you want to convey if you're talking to. Look, so occasionally I write articles for the New York Times for
mm,
their well section, and they're very rigorous. Like they want to get things right, but their concept of what qualifies as jargon is absolutely um, it's very hard to deal with. I feel like I've already like simplified it down from level 10 to level 2, and they're like, no, you have to go down another level. You can't use this word that has two syllables in it. I'm exaggerating here, but it's
mm.
um yeah, the article and so I cringe sometimes when my articles have gone through editing, but I also, I'll have debates with editors. An editor will say, "Well, this isn't clear. I don't understand what you're saying here." And my inside my head voice is, "What do you mean it's not clear? Like it couldn't be possibly be clearer." But the editor is signaling to me that there's a large portion of the audience that won't understand what I'm saying if I don't explain it more clearly. And sometimes more clearly means leaving out some of the caveats and nuances.
Mm, mm. I'm interested to know your thoughts, and we talk about this a lot about the sort of the amount of social media and YouTubes, and you've got lots of these so-called experts that coming up all over the place, and credibility is becoming more and more important. Do you find that that you're sort of fighting against the stream here when you have all these various so-called experts coming into the social media space, the internet space, the online space, all of them experts? And how do you think you can differentiate yourself from that noise, a lot of which is not credible?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I would say, are we fighting about this, fighting against this, or have we already lost the war? Like it's hard. Um, and and I say this as someone. Look. It's interesting because I'm a journalist, right? I'm not a scientist in this area, but because I've been writing about it for a long time, I'll sometimes go on podcasts and people will introduce me and like, yo, tell us about your research in this area. And I'm like, I haven't done any research. I'm an interpreter.
Mm,
And so but in the age of of social media, everyone and including me by association is it gets sort of you're trying to position your unique authority. It's not just like here's some information that I'm passing on. It's so and so is an expert, and so as you said, basically there's this vast sea of self-anointed experts, and I would say even in among scientists now, a lot of scientists are doing a better job at communicating directly um, with the general public. But now I look around, I look on social media, and I see lots of scientists. I'm like, that guy's full of crap. Like he's affiliated with the university, but what he's saying makes no sense. And so it's like the traditional markers of like, oh, he's got a PhD, or oh, he is writing for this prestigious publication, don't necessarily signal anymore what authority is. And so I don't honestly, I wish I had a good answer. It's like, here's how to determine. You guys did a whole episode on bro science, how to, or not a whole episode, but you had a segment on how to protect yourself from bro science. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how you compete with Huberman, who has prestigious credentials, uh, speaks the language of science, but in my opinion, at least, dispenses a lot of crap, and which takes to debunk or to explain why his view on a particular supplement that he happens to sell is oversimplified, or it takes a lot of energy, and no one's listening. So sorry, that's not an answer to your question. It's more like it's a really hard thing. I don't know how to handle it. And social media, it's like, oh man, it's a complex and ever changing field. So just when you think you've kind of established yourself somewhere, it's like, no one goes there anymore. Everyone else is somewhere else.
What's the there's a name of something, I think, is it Brandolini's law, where
The exponential,
the energy required to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude greater than the energy required to create it.
and that's the sort of the tragedy of our era, I think, because it's era the tragedy of social media. Yeah, absolutely, that's exactly it. It's
So like
crazy.
sometimes, even this morning, someone on Twitter says, "What do you think of this?" Because Noakes and his crew have just published a new like lit review showing that carbs are bad and you should just have fat and the whole carb paradigm's wrong. And it's nothing new in it. So those of you who's asked me on Twitter, there's really nothing new there to respond to. It's the same conversation we've had for 2 years. But people will ask, "What do you think of this?" As though it's like a quick answer. But to try and critique something, you've got to know it from 10 different perspectives. It's almost impossible. That's why to try and take on like a Huberman when he makes those claims is it's just a waste of energy. I don't think you can make a dent in it. You just have to run parallel to it, not in opposition to it, if that makes sense. But like, what
Yeah,
are
that's
when you said there, in your opinion, like Huberman, like, and I don't, I don't want to pick on Huberman, there's a half a dozen of them we could go with. But like, what are the things that allow you to make that opinion? Like, what are the things? Because I want listeners to acquire some of the wisdom that you've acquired through years and years and years of looking at papers with a critical eye, and they can't necessarily do that. So, what goes into your Brandolini bullshit detector?
so the trajectory of I guess the biggest ingredient is that I've been doing this long enough that I can look back at all the things that I wish I hadn't written, the things I've gotten wrong. And so when I started out with looking at studies with the lens of an athlete who had been obsessed with getting marginally faster, I was excited every time I read a study about um, tart cherry juice, or whatever the supplement, what this, baking soda, nitrate, And so I would write, I would say, oh, well, oh my God, this one has a peer-reviewed paper, and it was a double-blinded, placebo-controlled study. So that this means this one actually works. My God, like let's. So I'd write that article, and and then it's like throwing a pebble down a well. Nothing happens, and maybe it's a fad among athletes for a few years, and then 5 years later, you're like, whatever happened to that supplement that I wrote about where there was a peer-reviewed study? And you look back, and either you find that nobody has studied it since, or at least no one has published anything since, or there have been a bunch. Sometimes it's really clear. A bunch of people have published studies, and it doesn't work after all. Um, but mostly, it's just like it's been abandoned, probably because a few people have studied it with master's students, and nothing happened, so they didn't even bother publishing it. So, in other words, the number one rule that or at least insight that I acquired through experience is that even a well-designed, a beautiful looking study that you cannot that there's no obvious critiques of. It's not like it was funded by the wrong person or it was unblinded. A good study doesn't mean it's going to be true and hold up because there's this whole publication bias issue and things happen by chance or whatever, or you can sort of p-hack to get a significant result. So, in other words, what I'm saying is, I think what a lot of people fall for in someone like Huberman is he says, I think you should take, Eye of Newt in order to get better sleep. And here's a study that shows it. And they kind of look it up and skim the title or the abstract and say, well, I'll be darned. There is a study in the Journal of the Eye of Newt or whatever. So I guess it's true. Let's start doing this. And then they start doing it and they like, oh, I feel pretty good today. I guess it works. So they've confirmed with very quick anecdotal experience what seems to be told by peer-reviewed journals. And so I guess I no longer believe anything unless there really believe anything unless there's a preponderance of evidence, like a pattern of evidence. A single study isn't enough. And so that's why, like, look, not that we're getting into health advice here, but like I don't take any supplements. I just am not convinced by the bigger this and better the study is on any supplement, the less likely it is to do anything. I think baking soda probably works. Maybe beet juice. But there's just so many things that don't pan out when you study them long enough. And I guess okay, so that's part one of the answer to like how do you defend yourself against human. Part two is look around the website, and if they're selling that product, don't believe that their opinion on it. Like it's just apparently so easy to set up your own bespoke line of supplements. It's like everyone in this space is selling like Alex's fancy pills and presumably making lots of money about it. And it's just like, that's a reliable indicator that you're not getting straight information about something.
Mm. So, I'm asking you to probably even expand a bit more. So when you go through the research plan around the books that you've written, you're then taking, because obviously those books are going to be published for many years to come. It's not just a sweat science column that it might appear and be flavor of the week or whatever. But when you're writing a book, there's a lot of gravitas in making sure that book is right. So your plan is the rigorous nature of your research is finding these patterns to ensure that whatever you're getting into those books is rigorously researched beyond just papers here and there. Because I guess it's a subject that we're all very passionate about, is this very issue about establishing credibility. Because I disagree with you slightly in the fact that I don't think we have lost the war. I think credibility will actually win out in the end because there is so much rubbish going on and people are learning to be discerning now more than they ever have. So I think credibility is actually very important. So just kind of expand a bit more about that rigorous nature of that research when you're looking particularly at a book.
Yeah. So, okay. First of all, I hope you're right. And I do think, look, I don't mean to be overly pessimistic. I think some people are absolutely becoming more and more literate. I know I'm a lot more scientifically literate than I was 20 years ago and more discerning in who I take information from. In terms of how I make sure the book isn't just like a collection of these, one-shot studies that I then regret. First of all, it's not a perfect process. If I look back at books I've written, there's stuff that I would take out for sure. Second, I guess if I were to say, look, I want my book to only contain stuff that I'm really, really confident about, that it's absolutely credible, the book would be really short. It would probably be like 6 pages. And so in a book, I think you give yourself scope to talk about things that are still speculative. But you also, in a book, have room to explain why they're speculative and to give the context, hopefully, and to allow readers to make informed judgments as to the extent to which they believe this. So again, going back to what I said before about like the perfect sweat science column is like, here's a new study, here's the key data from it, and here's some things to consider when you look at this data. Here's some context of what came before, and some reasons to maybe be skeptical of it or whatever, some mechanisms. So in a book like Endure, I don't think everything in there would necessarily stand the test of time. Like a good example would be I had a chapter on electric brain stimulation. and I found that research quite convincing at the time. To me, the question at the time was not is this a real thing, but like, can you harness it in a practical sense, in a consumer grade device? But the more time goes on, the fewer studies I see backing it up, and the more studies I see that are failing to find a significant effect. And so I'm actually I don't know. I genuinely do not know whether there's a real effect there of electric brain stimulation on endurance performance. Um,
But
and
but it's
so
a great topic.
yeah, like,
It's
to me, it's
it's
fascinating. And I
just
think
fascinating. Yeah.
it's worth discussing because of what it said. Not for me, not because I think that we should be like, okay, let's get all our athletes wired up with electric brain stimulation, but because if it works, to me, it's such a direct demonstration that yeah, your limits are determined by in your brain, not in your muscles, because I can alter how your neurons are talking to each other, and that's going to alter your physical limits. So I was very attracted to that idea because it sort of dovetailed with what I thought was the trend of all this research coming out of Tim's and other labs.
Mm.
But now the evidence is a lot weaker than it was, and so but I would say I don't think it was like wrong of me to write about transcranial direct current stimulation in a book that came out in 2018, but hopefully I gave it enough space and explanation to understand that here's the nature of the evidence. There's a few studies. There's one in Brazil. There's a couple more in Britain that suggest it might work. But that's a verdict that can be overturned, and I think maybe is in the process of being overturned
Mm.
now. So yeah, I guess I don't know that I have a clear, concise answer, but a book gives you enough space to um, to give the nuances and the caveats and the context that isn't going to be in a one shot article that you write that shows up one day and is gone the next for a running magazine or whatever.
So if you look at a book like in, I think 2011, you wrote the book, Which Comes First, Cardio versus Weights. If you look at that book and what you know now, is there a lot of stuff in that book that you would change if you had to do a second edition now?
So one example. So this book, Which Comes First, Cardio Weights, is basically structured as 111, I think it was, common questions and answers on fitness. So grouped into categories. So it's like, how long does it take to get fit? How long does it take to lose fitness? How should I warm up? Things like that. And the shtick, the conceit was that I wouldn't tell you. I didn't call any coaches. I didn't call any veteran athletes. I didn't rely on my own experience. Everything was based on what do we know from the peer-reviewed research. Now, there's a few things in there where it's like I can't believe I put that in there. Like at the time, there was a study that came out about performance mouthpieces, where it's like you wear this mouthpiece, it changes your jaw alignment slightly, you can breathe better, and so it changes your lactate threshold. And there were studies and blah, blah, blah. But I just haven't heard anything about that since. I don't think that's a real thing. And so I'm like, man, I can't believe I put 2.5 pages on that. That was a real swing and a miss. And that's a great example of like the kind of thing that I'm more on guard for now. Now, there's other topics in there that have evolved more gradually. Things like barefoot running, hydration, carbohydrates versus fat,
Yeah.
things where there's been a lot of discussion in the years. I look back at what I wrote occasionally. This is now 15 years ago, and it's like, okay, fortunately, I'm a pretty like on the fence guy. I'm not someone who expresses things very strongly in black and white. I usually have a lot of caveats, and so I think those caveats have stood me well in the sense that even though I guess I would generally class myself as a barefoot running skeptic. I didn't go out and say barefoot running is a bunch of charlatans trying to make money. I said, there's some interesting evidence that suggests that that it has these potential benefits, but in practice in the real world, that no one has demonstrated that it's a better thing. So yeah, there's some swings and misses, but there's also more just some like hedging my bets where I would probably make it land a little bit differently now because of the way research has evolved, but it's not like those topics have changed like a huge amount.
And I guess, I mean, science isn't, you don't know what science is going to raise down the line. So it's impossible to say that you're making a mistake because science evolves, as we all know. And therefore, whatever you've changed your mind about is probably because there's new evidence that's come out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the mouthpiece stuff, I would say that was a mistake, but yeah. I mean, we all, in theory, like to think we'll change our mind if new evidence comes. I will say, like, one of the things I've noticed having been writing about a similar area for like 15 years or whatever is when I first started writing in this area, I felt like I had a bit of a superpower in that I had no preconceived notions and I wasn't on anybody's team. I didn't care who was right or wrong. Like in the sort of Noakes versus everyone else debate, I didn't know either party. I didn't do my PhD with either group. I didn't have any loyalties to anyone. So I really felt free to just sort of read the papers and share what I thought. I didn't feel like I had the authority to decide who was right or wrong, but so I felt that that gave me an ability to, in a relatively neutral way, say, here's what this side thinks and here's what that side thinks. After 15 years, over time, I've developed opinions. I tried not to, but I'm human, and so I've ended up taking positions on what I think about things like dehydration. And so I notice now when I'm scanning through the table of contents of a journal, it's harder for me to just look at them dispassionately. That if there's a paper that contradicts something that I've written before, I really have to like my inclination is to just keep turning the page, keep scrolling. That must be wrong. I've already looked into this, and so that I know a lot more than I did 10 years ago, and that helps. But I've also lost some of the outsider status that I think was a, a good tool to be able to write about the content and not get caught up in the sort of personalities and debates that were there. So yeah, I can't remember why I started saying that, but it's helpful to be on the outside, but you can't have both. You can't be an expert and be totally not have opinions. I think.
Hmm.
Ross, you wanted to ask something?
No, no, nothing to ask. I mean, it's just like when when you're writing about this as a journalist, you actually have a certain freedom. You don't have to hold on to an opinion too strongly because you're effectively just interpreting what other people have done. The reason scientists are sometimes less trustworthy as sources of information is because they actually do have to hold on to things for their own credibility, which is the crazy thing, right? You should be seen as more credible when you change your mind, but in general, I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, so my uncle was a physicist, and he did his PhD in this. I can't even remember it was some sort of condensed matter theory that ended up being basically wrong. It's like, but how do you accept that you've spent 8 years working on a theoretical framework that turns out it just doesn't work?
Yeah.
And some people have to do sometimes the empirical evidence is clear enough that you're like, oh, I guess we were wrong. But in most cases, it's that cliche that, scientific paradigms change, as scientists die or whatever, not as people change their minds. Because it's very hard to change your minds when all of your career prestige is built up on one thing. And Ross, you're right. As a journalist, it should be easier to, I probably is easier to change your mind. Again, the longer you've been in a given area and staked your flag on certain positions, the harder it is. You're subject to some of the same problems. So, for instance, I wrote this book Endure, which basically, if people were to sum it up in one word or one sentence, is like, your limits are determined as much in the brain as they are determined in part in the brain, not just in the body. Now, if someone were to come out with some really good research showing that actually the brain is totally irrelevant and physiology, marathon performance can be predicted exclusively by VO2 max, lactate threshold, and running economy, I would have a hard time taking that I would have a hard time writing about that or taking it seriously. I would set higher hurdle. I would instinctively go
Mm.
looking for holes in that study. I'd say, oh, n equals only 200. That's not very many subjects, and that's not enough. Or I'd say, well, I don't think they pre-registered their. Um, I mean, I hope I wouldn't do this, but I think this is the way we push in that if there's an idea that I've become associated with, then it's much harder to evaluate conflicting evidence. And this is human nature, and it's something scientists definitely have to fight against. But I think journalists aren't immune to that problem.
Yeah, I mean, like when I was studying under Tim, and this came up in that story of endurance podcast that we did, but also on the dehydration thing. I remember sharing an office with people who were studying heat and dehydration, and there was very much a culture of us versus the world because Tim was the person who was taking on the establishment, and we were in that glow, as it were. The result of that is that then when you then meet people who are on the other side of that argument and they're arguing that dehydration is harmful at 2% or whatever it is, and fluid replacement needs to be X, Y, Z, your first reaction is to reject them as part of another tribe, you know? So you get tribalism in knowledge, which is a massive thing. And again, it's the reason that people, I think people are learning that scientists are not necessarily the unimpeachable authorities without any conflicts of interest or biases or emotions or opinions that have been warped by personalities and identities. Which is destabilizing because you'd like them to be, but they're not. And oftentimes they're less reliable than people who are not immersed in it because those people who are not immersed are less likely to be tribal about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I was saying in the sense that 15 years ago, when I really didn't know a lot about
Mm,
physiology, I had a superpower, which was that I didn't care who was right. And so I was just tell me what your evidence is. Tell me what you think. Now, even if I'm not on anybody's side, I've formed opinions of which set of like on dehydration. I don't think that 2% is in the real world is a problem. And so I see studies that purport to show that 1% dehydration harms performance, and I just instinctively am looking for flaws, even though I'm not, even though I'm only an ancillary member of
mm,
that tribe. So it is tricky. And I do remember probably around 2010, 2011, when I was just maybe 2010 or so, just starting to dig into the debate about central governor and things like that. And I spent time talking to Tim Noakes, and he's very very persuasive. And Tim had just had a point counterpoint with Ben Levine about VO2 max and what limited it. And so I called up Ben Levine, and he was also like, he's a smart guy, and I had a great conversation with him, and trying to convince me of the sort of traditional point of view. And I'm calling up people and trying to figure out, well, okay, but who's right? And finally, I talked to a guy named Stephen Chung at Brock University, who had done some work that, superficially at least to me, seemed to support Tim Noakes's views. And so I expected him to just toe the line or toe that line. But I called him up and we talked on the phone, and his answer was basically like, honestly, I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just trying to do studies that test the assumptions of either one to figure it out. And he said the thing to remember is that science, the scientific method may be, this great thing, but science is a human endeavor. Science
mm,
is done by humans, and so the interpretation and the is subject to all the human foibles of wanting credit and not wanting to change opinions and stuff. And that really stuck with me. And it's humans are great. Journalists are human too. But yeah, this idea that I started out with, that if I just call up a scientist who's at a university, then I have locked and loaded, guaranteed credibility. I've got the truth here. It's unfortunately that's as you say, that's not correct.
So I'm interested to ask both of you this question, and this is my journalistic side coming out here now. Alex, in your book, Endure, you talk a lot about the mind over matter, about the fact that you've got perceived limits versus actual limits. You give examples of divers that can hold their breath for 8 minutes, etc., etc. And Ross has often said in this podcast that physiology always catches up with you. I want to ask maybe Ross to kick off the discussion because is there a tension between those two schools of thought versus is it mind over matter or does physiology catch up with you? What comes first?
Just remember the brain is also matter. That's all I'll
Yes.
say to that one. Like, not there's like this weird polarized, sort of forced juxtaposition of mind versus matter, but they're both matter. One might be more complicated than we're capable of understanding, but when someone's fatigued and you say it's central in the brain, there's still a neurotransmitter thing somewhere. You just don't know where to measure it. You can still measure MRI, brain waves, EEGs, and so on. We just don't always know what they mean. But there's still something physiological happening, even when the limit is a perceived one, I think.
Mm,
Yeah, there's a great quote in so there's that study Ikai and Steinhaus from like the 1960s where they snuck up behind people, like had people doing maximum voluntary contractions, then snuck up and like fired a gun in their ear, right behind their heads, and all of a sudden they developed more strength. And there's a line in that study that is basically, I hope I'm not butchering it, but something along the lines of uh, psychology is just a special case of brain physiology. So, which is saying exactly what Ross just said, that if you have thoughts and emotions and feelings that are affecting your performance, um, that's that you can describe those physiologically. Like it's not, at least from the from their perspective, it's not that your soul has decided to create more energy. It's just a different way of in your brain regulating the energy that's available or the power that's available. So the mind over matter thing is because it's such a it's a cliche, right? And it's associated with a lot of charlatans, that you can bend the spoon with your mind or whatever. Um, yeah, it sort of triggers some negative associations. I think, yeah. So that language, people can understand what you mean, but I think
mm,
ultimately, yeah, that there's not a conflict. It's just a question of like if I so to do if you want to do studies of pure muscle physiology, you can use electric stimulation, right, to find out how strong someone's muscle is. And saying mind over matter, another way of saying that is to say that you can't just take an electric stimulation machine, measure someone's quadriceps, and then measure the size of their heart and know everything about what they're going to do on a given day in a given situation in a given competitive context. That the actual amount of juice you're able to squeeze out of the lemon of your body is going to depend on stuff that you're going to experience as thoughts and feelings and emotions and maybe even unconsciously picking up what you're picking up from the environment and
mm.
processing via your brain.
Because I mean,
I don't know.
you said it. You said on podcasts, and I've seen some videos of you talking about the whole idea behind this. In your experience, you tell the story about how you broke your 1500-meter PB after many years of not trying, and then you found out they were giving you the wrong splits on a race that you were doing, and you ended up running sort of a 12-second PB. So was is that my perception of your what you've learnt is that the mind matters a lot more than we think. Whereas it feels like you're being slightly more cagey now and saying that yes, we still have to consider physiology, etc., etc. And as Ross said, the mind is part of that. But for the consumer out there, for me, I want to know that if I can push myself 2% more via my mind, if I know that my mind is the thing holding me back, there's a perception about what I could achieve when I'm going up a hill on my bike or running or whatever, that I can achieve more if my mind was able to just push 1% more. So it's a very important fact because, for us as journalists, being able to tell that story is quite important. So I'm just interested to know where you stand with it. Like when you're writing something in your Sweat Science column about something like this, how do you explain this and to people who are wanting to be better and to find out what their limits are?
Yeah, well, so it's a complicated question, but
Mm,
a couple things. Um, to say that the mind matters isn't this or and is important isn't the same as saying it's just a question of trying harder. So like the story of my story of having a big breakthrough in the 1500, which was and because they were calling out the wrong splits. What's crucial there is that this didn't happen because I realized they were calling out the wrong splits and decided to try harder and was able to push myself harder. This happened totally under the hood. I didn't know anything was happening, but it was clearly not mediated. No one was. It's not that someone accidentally gave me extra sodium bicarbonate and I had more, ability to buffer lactate. This was mediated by the brain, but not just a question of trying harder. And I think so. A lot of the sort of how does the mind matter? What we're saying is that the context matters. That in a race you're able to run faster than in a workout. I would say for me, and you could say it's because you push harder in the race, but it's like I do workouts pretty hard sometimes. Like I'm trying as hard as I can, but the context of the race changes what that level of effort means in terms of the signals my brain is sending to my muscles. Um, so I guess the other aspect of this is that I do think that if you look at the literature on sports psychology, which is a challenging literature, it's a hard thing to study, and on self-talk, motivational self-talk, on telling, on the internal monologue and the effect that may have on performance. And look, these studies are definitely not bulletproof.
Mm.
But I come to the belief that the story you tell yourself about whether your brain matters might matter.
Mm.
That if you believe uh, that you have I guess it's kind of like the difference between like growth mindset or fixed mindset. If you believe that uh, whether you're good at math or not is just a function of whether you were born to be good at math, and then you get 13 out of 20 on your first test, and you decide, well, I'm just bad at math, and then you're uninterested in math, you don't study for math, you remain bad at math for the rest of your life. Whereas if you believe it's within you to get better at math, you have this growth mindset, you work hard at, and you become good at math. So it's like if you believe that running a race is just a question of it's effectively a proxy measure of just like we're going to test your VO2 max and your lactate threshold and your running economy, but we're going to do them all together in this thing we call a 5K race. Then you go out and get smoked. And you're like, well, I guess I'm not very good at those things, and I can train. I'm going to go and try and improve my VO2 max a little bit, but it feels to me like that having that sort of fixed belief that competitions are just a physiology contest. Uh,
Mm.
it I guess I'm venturing outside the science here, but I guess my belief, having spent time thinking about this and looking at what the science says, is that it can be adaptive and productive to believe that um, that the degree to which that motivation uh, and yeah, pushing harder, that these things are theoretically possible, that there is more in there, that when you feel like you've hit the wall in the third lap of a 1500, that this isn't just an objective reality, that means you must slow down, that by fighting against it you can actually maybe squeeze more out of yourself. So I don't know if I'm going too far, and like I would say, look,
Yeah.
I've done some podcasts where, right, they're like corporate podcasts. It's like for entrepreneurs, how do you push harder? And all the questions are like, so how do we get this belief? And it's like, so probably the message I meant end up giving there is less nuanced than the message I would give to competitive athletes. But yeah, I guess the distinction I'm making is it's not just a question of trying harder. It's recognizing that the feeling of fatigue is not an objective reality that means you must slow down, and that's it.
Mm.
That there's some room for negotiation with it, and believing in that can in turn maybe allow you to access it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
So I mean, I'll be running out
I'll
of
give you
time
an
here, but
example.
Ross,
I'll give you.
yeah, go,
Sorry,
Ross.
sorry. I just want to say, like, when you talk about doing this sort of corporate spiel, and I've been guilty of this as well. When you go and you talk to, like, we've got this Two Oceans race, and you'll go and you'll talk to these runners, and all you want to leave them with on a Friday before the race, whatever, is a bit of feel good motivation and make them go out there think that they can believe. And then you'll tell the story about Roger Bannister and the 4 minute mile and how there was an Australian called John Landy who tried 6 times to break 4 minutes and never ran slower than 4 minutes 3 seconds, but was never faster than 4:02. I know you've told this story in order to correct some of the misconceptions. So Alex knows this. He's part of the Truth Brigade on this one. Um, and Landy then was alleged to have said, the 4 minute mile is a brick wall and I won't attempt it again. And then, sure enough, Bannister runs 3:59.4 in Oxford in 1954 on the 6th of May, 1953, I think it was. No, 54. 53
Four.
was Everest. And within a few weeks of that, Landy is flown from Australia to Finland, I think, and he runs 3:58. And everyone says Bannister had to show him the way. And Bannister believed and Landy didn't. And that was the difference between them. And then you can even make it sexy and you can say Bannister ended up being a neurologist and he knew the power of the brain. And you can really embellish this and make people charge out of that room, inspired to run a PB at the Two Oceans. More complex than that, and what people leave out, is that Landy was running his 402s on these dirt tracks that were in pretty shoddy condition down in Australia without any benefit of pace setters. And when they took him to Finland, he ran on really compacted surface with pace setters. And you could make a good case that that's 4 seconds worth. And that was the difference for Landy, not Bannister. So when you're telling this story as a mind over matter illustration, are you being truthful if you leave out the last part?
Yeah.
That's
So
the,
yeah, I think the context is definitely um yeah, like Landy had Chataway taking him all pushing him all the way to like 1,300 meters or something like that. So I think that yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think what I actually think about the Bannister story because yeah, I told that story in Endure as a like here's the conventional story, but here's what was left out. Um, yeah, I don't know if we can say that Bannister had more belief than Landy,
exactly.
but I would say
Exactly.
that
That's the point.
but I think we can say that Bannister had belief. Like
Yes.
actually,
Yeah.
you know
And
what?
you can,
If we told it the other way, you look through his book and he's full of self-doubt actually. He's saying I don't want to do it. I don't think we can do it. And his coach is having to say, look, you're capable of running 3:56 even though it's windy today, just go out there and do it. So had Bannister not done it and Landy had, we probably could be telling the opposite story. So but I guess I would say for either of those guys to reach world class, they probably had mastered something that a lot of people who don't reach world class don't master.
mm,
It's unlikely that by learning to believe a world class athlete gets better, but I think there are people with very good physiology who self sabotage in races who don't
yeah,
who
no
don't
doubt.
believe.
So the relevance of that story to your original question, Mike, is that when you're telling these stories about the outcome, a performance, a sub 4 minute mile in Landy or Bannister's case, you can always like simplify it to say it was one thing. But in reality, it's going to be a multiple. And it's the same thing with fatigue. So tomorrow morning when we're cycling up Constantia Neck and you're saying to yourself at 250 watts, I'm cooked, you're at 7 out of 10, where 10 is the ultimate physiological limit. If you reach 10, you'd fall over and die. So nobody does that, right? Unless they've got some underlying pathology. But then the pathology gets them before they're at maximum. You know, it's a guy doing an easy training run with an underlying cardiomyopathy. It's not the maximal exertion. It's just he's got some pathology. But if you imagine like there's a line at 10 and your failure point subjectively is at 7, you've got room to improve in. And training will teach you that and you'll learn what can I tolerate and so on. And that's mind. If you want to file that under mind or brain. But at the same time, if we then did a month's worth of training with you and we had you doing torque intervals and VO2 max intervals to improve your climbing at 250 watts, a month from now you'd say, I can do this. It's not just that your brain has accepted that you can do it, it's also that you've changed the muscle, the lungs, the heart, the blood by the training. So this notion of like taking what is effectively a rope with hundreds of different interconnected fibers and pretending that you can take one fiber out and say that's the bit that gives the rope its strength is nonsense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But we also know occasions when athletes have gone to failure. I think, what was it, Rosie Diaz, or there was the marathon runners that have collapsed on the finishing line. We've seen athletes collapse. So my theory is that is there not something about elite athletes which means they can push that 1 or 2% mentally? They can push it to 8%, as opposed to the average person that can push it to 7% of their max. Surely there must be some
Yeah.
aspect of that, the percentage of that. I know it's difficult to measure, but that's why it's the ultimate question, isn't it? Whether elite athletes have more, they can dig deeper than the
So
average.
So I think maybe another good example is, and this is one when I asked Tim Noakes, like, what's the strongest evidence for your theories? He said it's the finishing spurt. And so
Yes.
most people finish with a sprint finish, even elite athletes. And to me, that's maybe, and there's some complicated physics. You can argue the finishing spurt in different ways, but to me, ultimately, the fact that people mostly speed up at the end of a race is an indicator that they uh, didn't get everything out of themselves, that they would have benefited from pushing harder earlier in the race, like in the middle of the race, and that this is something that's changeable. And so when I look back at, I was a 1,500-meter runner and I tried to move up to 5,000 and I just couldn't get it right. I always felt like I was about to die in the fourth K. And then I would just close like an absolute hero in the last lap, which was stupid. But that was, and so I think the way to fix that, of course, I was training as hard as I could and as well as I could. But ultimately, the fix to that, had I had more opportunities to run the 5,000, would have been something you could classify as kind of mind over matter, which is learning to hurt more at a different stage in the race, changing what Ross would call the template of that I was setting for how hard things should feel at a given place, and that's a mental thing. And so it's not universal, but I would say to your point, Mike, um, if you were to look at if you had a magic RPE meter that measures what effort people are expending partway through the race, elite athletes are probably able to hang out at a higher RPE earlier in the race for longer and leave less in the tank than
Mm.
if you go to your local 5K fun run and you see people, jogging around the corner and then they see the final sprint and or the final straight and they launch into a sprint. People are less uh, the amount of safety margin they're leaving, which is probably fundamentally unmeasurable. But if you could imagine you would measure it, I would imagine elites are leaving less safety margin.
Yeah. I know we're running out of time
that
here, but
said,
I just
that
wanted to.
said,
Sorry, Ross.
what would your prediction be for where you'd see most athletes collapse at the finish line? Would it be in the top quarter of the race or the last quarter?
Huh. That's Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my answer to that is informed by the idea that most people who collapse at the finish line, it's after they cross the finish line, and it's not a function
Yeah.
of that they pushed hard. It's a function of the blood redistribution so then I would say that the unfit athletes are probably more likely to collapse. Um,
Yeah, but it's not an indication of being closer to their limits. You're right. That's not
right.
the best example. But where in the race would you see the, maybe this is also, I'm just sort of thinking about this out loud now. If we talk about failure, not necessarily as I collapsed, but as I had to slow down significantly, right? In other
Yeah.
words, I've got to run 42.2K. Like I can't, I'm not going to collapse at 34. I'll walk. So that you don't see absolute failures often. I wonder where you'll see more of that massive drop off.
So my hypothesis would be that you'd see greater variance in the slow runners and less variance in the fast runners. So the fast runners,
No,
they're all dialed in really close to the limits, and occasionally some of them overcook it and blow up, and occasionally some of them
mm,
undercook it and have a strong finish. In the slow runners, you're going to have both extremes. You're going to have a bunch of people who just totally misjudge and are literally walking to the finish line for the last 15K. But you're also going to have a bunch of people who are fundamentally unstressed. Uh, they're three-quarters of the way through the race and they're laughing and walking or whatever. They haven't pushed themselves hard enough. So you're going to get both extremes there because they have less experience at riding that red line.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Alex, I know you've written a few books. My final question to you is, what's coming up? Would you be able to give us a bit of an idea about maybe another book that you have in mind, or maybe a book that you'd like to write that you think might be because you've covered, all of the questions, 15 years ago. You've done Endure, you've done the Explorer's Gene, which is your book that you've released in 2025. What's on the horizon?
So I'm just starting a project in very early stages, working with a collaborator. So I don't know exactly what form it will take or how it will go, but basically trying to look at the experience of running, the what goes on in the brain when you run, because the answer that we run for fitness doesn't really hold up for people who stick with it, and this applies to a lot of endurance sports, and that we were born to run or what. It's like I don't get up at 6:30 because my ancestors chased antelopes or whatever. So tr basically trying to look at the neuroscience of running and the psychological experience of running and try to understand what it feels like to be out pushing yourself and what it is that for some people at least keeps them coming back.
Nice.
On a similar theme, have you over the last 15 years acquired a sense of that allows you to be able to predict which way the wind's going to shift next in sports sciences? Like if you think back, 2025, I'd characterize as a big year for carbs, 120 gram an hour. It was a big year for protein. And there was a lot of talk about heat training as the new altitude training. For example, I don't. Now, obviously, we're only aware of what we're exposed to. So, with the recognition of our own biases, what do you reckon are the big stories in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the answer to your question is no. I haven't developed a very good radar. I find out about things and I'm like, well, I'll be damned. We're talking about carbs this year, really? I had no idea. And so I mean, I think like it or not, wearable tech and AI,
Mm,
the combination of those two things is going to be um, it's going to be big. Whether it's actually useful, I remain like for me, if you talk about wearable tech and stuff like heart rate variability and stuff, and there's neat studies I've written about them a lot. I've still never seen a study that shows that heart rate variability outperforms asking yourself how do you feel, or having your coach ask you how you feel. So like you set up the study to show that training by HRV is better than having a rigid training plan that was written 3 months in advance. Like, sure, okay, but who does that, right? Like, if you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. Um,
mm,
so, but now it's like, okay, AI can do a bunch of things that are not like intuitive. It's like beyond what my intuition of what a machine can do is, and then we can measure all these things with all these devices. So if you wire yourself up like a hamster, and feed all the data into a computer, is it actually going to be capable of doing what scientists were trying to do with Breaking 2 10 years ago, which is like we're analyzing everything and determining who needs to go harder when. It's like maybe that arrives, and so I think that that's going to be a big question, and I will watch the outcome skeptically, but either way, we're going to be hearing about it.
it's
Yeah.
a little bit like fashion, where like bell bottoms are back, and you say, "Wow, that's versus 1978." And then in sports science, you say bicarbonate is back.
Yeah,
19. What's the best study on bicarbonate performance? Well, in 1982, they did some studies on kayakers. You know what I mean? Like that's where we are. So I also wonder what'll be next. But there's no doubt, like tech and computers, AIs, machine learning, big data, and how it's relevant to chat. Like we spoke about on a spotlight now. ChatGPT are launching something they're calling like the God of Fitness and Health or something, like everything all in one, you
oh
know?
no.
So very ambitious plans to take on massive complexity. And it's crazy because like I still think sometimes how do you feel trumps every single one of those pieces of tech.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I think it's a useful psychological crutch to I could imagine it being. So it's like I wake up, I'm feeling pretty tired. I had a big week last week. Am I just being weak when I decide that when I think that maybe I should back off today? And it's like, oh no, the computer also says you're probably a little tired. So I could see that being useful, but I'm a bit of a uh I don't know, Luddite, I guess. I run with I don't run with GPS or anything. I only run with the Timex watch. So again, when we're talking about biases and preconceived notions, there's probably a part of me that like I'm happy running with just my Timex, so I don't want to discover that actually I could do better if I was, wiring myself up with 58 gadgets and plugging myself in. But maybe it's if the truth is going to be what the truth's going to be. So if that turns out to be a successful way of training, then that'll be interesting and can be fun in a way if it turns out that we can come up with new insights.
Last question from me. If you were approached tomorrow by a publisher of scientific journals, and you've obviously read a ton of scientific journal articles to try and tease out what do they mean, and then you translate that and interpret it, what would you tell the scientific journal editors to do,
Hmm.
to ask the scientists to do, to make their work more palatable outside of scientific journals?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a trend now of like plain language summaries, um,
Mm,
some of which are really good, and most of which are just like rephrasing the abstract while removing some of the numbers. And it's like really take time to make that plain language summary, which is, usually like 3 sentences long. Like really, really imagine you're explaining it to your grandfather, who has never studied science, and just like the abstract is there. The scientific people can read the abstract, have a proper plain language summary. Um, The other thing I would say is that for me, when I'm reading papers, I'm often reading papers in areas or skimming papers that I'm in areas that I'm not familiar with. And I would say the biggest differentiator as to whether I can make head or tail of whether a paper is interesting or useful is like the first, whatever, first section, the first 4 paragraphs, the background and context. Because I have no idea why you're trying to study the some obscure function, the fractal dimension of the blood flow during exercise. So rewind it. I know that you know why you're studying this. I know that everyone in your lab knows it, and I know that the 2 dozen people who are also studying this around the world already know why this is important. But the truth is, probably most other people in your department don't understand why you're studying this, and people outside the department definitely don't. So it's like there's some scientific papers which beautifully set the context and of why are we studying this particular thing? And if you do that, there's a lot of science that's really interesting. But someone like me, I can't. It's not. I can't even go walk through the door if if that motivation is not explained in a very general, very, very general sense. Uh, like starting from the assumption that someone is, let's say has a science degree, undergraduate science degree from a university, not 5 years of postdocing experience in this particular subspecialty. Sorry, I got off on a little bit of a tangent there. Or a little soapbox, but it's amazing how interesting it is when a scientific paper motivates the topic well, and it's amazing how totally impenetrable it is if they don't.
yeah, yeah. And I would say to them, just be direct and speak the simplest English you can. For some reason, and we're all guilty of it, when you start writing a scientific paper, you put on this like cloak of science, and all of a sudden you start finding like 6 syllable words when a 3 syllable word would have done. Why do we do that? It's so stupid. I've told so many students in the last 3 years, write this again, but try it in English this time, not academia.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter if
I
it's a
think
journal piece. That's a really good piece of advice, I think.
I guess the other thing yeah, just thinking of that, and why language gets so stilted, and sometimes I find to myself, it's like in certain contexts, I suddenly find myself reaching for the big words and the complicated sentence structures, and it's like we all want to be respected and valued by our peers, and not to look stupid to the people, and so I would say I think there's an instinct for scientists when you're writing it is to imagine the people down the hallway or the people in the rival department who disagree with you. What are they going to think about this? And this is true for, not to raise a whole nother topic, but for scientists talking to the media too. You try and interview a scientist and you get the sense that they're really worried about what the scientist next door will think about what they say. Overly worried because the scientist next door probably doesn't really care. But so they're so desperate to avoid saying something that appears that they're promoting themselves or that they're oversimplifying that they will only speak in the most abstract generalities, and they'll refuse to commit to anything. It's like, so does your study say this? Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say, like no, but please just tell me like what you must have done this study for some reason. Can't you tell me what the reason the study was done? Don't like think about don't think about the people closest to you, because they're only one out of 100,000 who might read this article and gain something from it. If you're willing to just to run the risk of not trying to look as smart as possible for your peers.
Mm. Good stuff.
Yeah, I know Ross and I have had discussions about this in the past. I think a lot of it's got to do with ego as well, to some extent, isn't it? Because you're trying to make sure that your place in that world is being respected, and I guess that's also important, because there is this sort of subtle competition, I guess, with people in the research area.
I do think that has shifted noticeably in the last 15 years, that there's much more tolerance for scientists actually trying to explain themselves, as opposed to maintaining the impregnable ivory tower. And going back to like Ross's blog in 2008, it's like that was a rare thing at the time, and now it's much more common that scientists actually want to speak for themselves and explain their work. Not as common as it should be, but it's I think it's a huge help. I think it's a really important role, and I think in today's context, in terms of science funding, it's like if we want society to keep funding research, yeah, you have to articulate why it matters.
Yeah. Alex Hutchinson, thank you very much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and I hope we're going to be able to get you back when you release your next publication, or maybe you've got an interesting topic you've been discussing, but I think we must definitely get you back to chat with us again. But thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me. You guys
cool.
do
Thanks, Alex.
Amazing work, so I appreciate it. It's a privilege to be on the show.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Science of Sport podcast.